Sarah Martinez had always been proud of her military service. After 8 years in the Navy as a communications specialist, she had earned her place among the dedicated men and women who served their country with honor. But, nothing in her military training had prepared her for what would happen on that crisp October morning at San Diego International Airport. She stood in line at the security checkpoint, her military ID ready in her weathered hands. The familiar weight of her service medal hung around her neck, a small token she wore whenever she traveled. Sarah had been invited to speak at a veterans conference in Phoenix, sharing her experiences about transitioning from military to civilian life. It was work she found deeply meaningful, helping other veterans navigate the challenging waters of returning to civilian society. The TSA agent, a young man with serious eyes and careful movements, examined her identification with unusual scrutiny. Sarah noticed his pause but thought nothing of it initially. She had grown accustomed to the extra attention that sometimes came with military credentials, especially in airports where security remained heightened. "Ma'am, could you step aside for a moment?" the agent asked, his voice carrying a tone that made Sarah's stomach tighten slightly. "Is there a problem with my ID?" she asked, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served her well during her years of service. The agent didn't answer immediately. Instead, he called over his supervisor, a stern-looking woman in her 40s who approached with measured steps. Sarah watched as they exchanged whispered words, pointing occasionally at her identification and, then, at something on their computer screen. "Ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us for additional screening," the supervisor announced, her voice professional but firm. Sarah felt a flutter of confusion mixed with the beginning edges of concern. "Additional screening? I've traveled with these credentials dozens of times without any issues. It's just routine, ma'am. Please gather your belongings and follow me." As Sarah collected her carry-on bag and jacket, she noticed other passengers in line watching the interaction with curious and, sometimes suspicious glances. The feeling of being scrutinized by strangers added an uncomfortable layer to an already puzzling situation. She had done nothing wrong, carried nothing prohibited, and possessed valid military identification that had never before caused any complications. The supervisor led her through a side door into a sterile corridor that Sarah had never seen during her many trips through this airport. The walls were painted an institutional beige, and fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, unflattering glow. They walked past several closed doors before stopping at one marked only with a number. Inside the small room, 2 additional security personnel waited. One was a tall man with graying hair who introduced himself as Agent Williams from Airport Security. The other was a woman in her 30s who remained silent but took notes throughout what followed. "Ms. Martinez, we need to ask you some questions about your military service," Agent Williams began, settling into a chair across from her at a small metal table. "Of course. What would you like to know?" Sarah replied, genuinely puzzled about why routine questions couldn't have been asked in the main security area. "According to our records, there are some discrepancies regarding your claimed military background." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. "Discrepancies? What kind of discrepancies?" "I served 8 years in the Navy Communications Division. I have all my discharge papers, commendations, and service records." Agent Williams consulted a file that Sarah couldn't see. "We have information suggesting that you may have misrepresented your military service, specifically claiming connections to Naval Special Warfare units." Sarah's mouth fell open in shock. "Naval Special Warfare? I never claimed any connection to Special Warfare. I was communications. I've never claimed to be anything other than what I was. Ma'am, we have reports of you wearing unauthorized insignia and making false claims about your service record, specifically claiming to be a Navy SEAL." The accusation was so absurd that Sarah almost laughed, but the serious expressions around her made it clear this was no joke. "This has to be some kind of mistake. I would never claim to be a SEAL. Anyone who knows me, anyone who served with me, can tell you exactly what my role was. We understand this may be confusing, but we need to verify your actual service record before we can allow you to travel." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to understand how such a serious misunderstanding could have occurred. Who reported this? Where is this information coming from? Agent Williams remained non-committal. "We can't discuss the specific sources of our information, but we take matters involving stolen valor very seriously." The term, stolen valor, made Sarah's blood run cold. She had heard about cases where civilians had falsely claimed military service or inflated their actual service records for personal gain. The idea that she could be accused of such a thing felt surreal and deeply offensive. "I want to call my commanding officer," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "Commander Harrison can verify my entire service record. We'll need to complete our initial investigation before any external contacts are made," Agent Williams replied. For the next 2 hours, Sarah found herself subjected to increasingly detailed questioning about her military service. They asked about specific dates, locations, unit designations, and fellow service members. Every answer she provided seemed to generate more questions, as if the investigators were looking for inconsistencies or contradictions in her story. She explained her role in communications, describing the technical systems she had worked with, the bases where she had been stationed, and the nature of her daily duties. She provided names of supervisors, fellow service members, and even specific mission details that she was authorized to discuss. Throughout it all, she maintained her composure, drawing on the discipline instilled during her military training. But, as the questioning continued, Sarah began to realize that her interrogators seemed to have predetermined conclusions about her guilt. Their questions weren't seeking to understand the truth of her service, they were trying to find evidence to support allegations she still didn't fully understand. "Ma'am, do you own any military insignia or decorations that might be considered inappropriate for your actual service record?" the note-taking woman asked. "I have the medals and ribbons I earned during my service, nothing more, nothing less," Sarah replied firmly. "Have you ever attended any events or gatherings where you might have given people the impression that you served in a special operations capacity?" Sarah thought carefully before answering. "I've attended many veterans events and military reunions. I've always been honest about my service record. I've never claimed to be anything other than a communications specialist." The investigators exchanged glances, and Sarah sensed that her answers weren't providing the clarity they expected. She began to suspect that someone had deliberately provided false information about her, but she couldn't imagine who would do such a thing or why. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah missed her flight to Phoenix. The conference organizers would be expecting her keynote speech the following morning, and she had no way to contact them or explain her situation. The investigators had confiscated her phone as part of their security protocols, leaving her completely cut off from the outside world. "How long is this going to take?" she asked during a brief break in the questioning. "That depends on how quickly we can verify your actual service record and resolve these discrepancies," Agent Williams replied. Sarah felt a growing sense of helplessness. She had done nothing wrong, yet found herself trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare that seemed to have no clear resolution. The investigators treated her with professional courtesy, but there was an underlying assumption of guilt that colored every interaction. As evening approached, Sarah learned that she would not be allowed to leave the airport facility until the investigation was complete. She was provided with basic accommodations in what amounted to a holding area, though the officials were careful not to call it detention. "This is insane," she murmured to herself as she sat on the narrow cot provided for her. The room was small and windowless, equipped with basic necessities but feeling more like a jail cell than temporary lodging. She thought about her daughter Emily, who would be expecting a call that evening. Emily was starting her senior year of college and often sought her mother's advice about career decisions and life challenges. Sarah had promised to help her review graduate school applications during their weekly phone call. She thought about her job as a veterans counselor, where she helped other former service members deal with exactly these kinds of bureaucratic nightmares. The irony wasn't lost on her that she, who spent her days helping veterans navigate complex military bureaucracies, now found herself trapped within that same system. Most of all, she thought about the 8 years of her life that she had dedicated to serving her country. She remembered the early morning drills, the long deployments away from family, the pride she had felt when she received her commendations for exceptional service. The idea that her service was being questioned, that someone had accused her of falsifying her military record, felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked for and believed in. As she lay on the uncomfortable cot, staring at the ceiling tiles, Sarah tried to piece together how this situation had developed. She thought about recent veterans events she had attended, conversations she had had, people she had met. Somewhere in those interactions, someone had misunderstood something she had said or done, leading to this nightmare scenario. She had worn her service medal to several recent events, the same medal she wore when traveling. It was a standard Navy Achievement Medal, nothing special or controversial. She wondered if someone had misidentified it or misunderstood its significance. She thought about a recent conversation with a fellow veteran who had asked about her military experience. She had mentioned working with classified communications equipment, which was part of her legitimate role. Could that have been misinterpreted as a claim to special operations involvement? The more she thought about it, the more frustrated she became. Military service members often worked with classified materials and sophisticated equipment without being part of special operations units. Her communications role had required security clearances and involved sensitive information, but that didn't make her a Navy SEAL. As the night wore on, Sarah found sleep difficult. The unfamiliar surroundings, the stress of the accusations, and the uncertainty about when this ordeal might end kept her mind racing. She had never felt so powerless, so unable to control a situation that was spiraling beyond her comprehension. She thought about the veterans she counseled, many of whom had faced their own bureaucratic challenges. She had always advised them to remain calm, to trust in the system's ability to ultimately reach the correct conclusion, and to maintain faith that the truth would prevail. Now she was putting her own advice to the test, hoping that her confidence in military justice and administrative procedures wasn't misplaced. The fluorescent lights in her room never fully dimmed, creating an artificial environment that made it difficult to distinguish between day and night. Sarah found herself checking her watch frequently, counting the hours since this nightmare had begun, wondering how much longer it might continue. In the morning, she would face more questions, more scrutiny, and more attempts to find fault with her service record. But, she also held on to hope that someone would recognize the mistake, that her real service record would be located and verified, and that this terrible misunderstanding would finally come to an end. The second day of Sarah's detention began with the arrival of new personnel. Agent Williams introduced her to Detective Morrison from the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, a branch she had hoped never to encounter as anything other than a topic of conversation among fellow veterans. Detective Morrison was a man in his 50s with steel-gray hair and eyes that seemed to examine everything with careful precision. Unlike the airport security personnel, he carried the authority of someone who investigated military crimes professionally, and his presence elevated the seriousness of Sarah's situation in ways that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. Ms. Martinez, I've been assigned to investigate allegations regarding your military service record, Detective Morrison began, his tone neutral but carrying an undertone of gravity that hadn't been present in previous interviews. Detective, I've been trying to explain since yesterday that there's been a terrible mistake. I never claimed to be a Navy SEAL. I served honorably as a communications specialist, and I have documentation to prove it. Detective Morrison opened a thick file folder and spread several documents across the table between them. Sarah could see photocopies of what appeared to be official forms, photographs, and typed reports, but she couldn't read them from her position. We've received multiple reports from different sources indicating that you've been representing yourself as a former Navy SEAL at various veterans events over the past 6 months, he said, consulting his notes. Additionally, witnesses claim to have seen you wearing SEAL Trident insignia. Sarah felt as if the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Multiple reports. What witnesses? I've never worn SEAL insignia. The only military decorations I wear are the ones I earned legitimately. Detective Morrison pulled out a photograph and placed it where Sarah could see it clearly. Her heart nearly stopped as she recognized herself at a veterans barbecue that had taken place 3 months earlier. In the photo, she was speaking with several other veterans, smiling and, apparently engaged in animated conversation. "Do you recognize this photograph?" Detective Morrison asked. "Yes, that was taken at a veterans gathering in Oceanside. I was invited to speak about veterans' mental health resources. According to witnesses who were present, you told several people that you had served with SEAL team operations." Sarah stared at the photograph, trying to remember every conversation from that day. She had spoken with dozens of people, sharing stories about military service and discussing the challenges of transitioning to civilian life. The accusation made no sense to her. "I never said that. I would never say that. I spoke about my communications work and about helping veterans access mental health services." Detective Morrison pulled out another document. "We have a signed statement from Marcus Thompson, a Marine veteran who was present at that event. He states that you specifically mentioned participating in classified SEAL operations during your Navy service." The name Marcus Thompson was unfamiliar to Sarah, though she had met so many veterans at various events that she couldn't remember everyone. "I don't recall meeting anyone by that name, and I certainly never mentioned participating in SEAL operations because I never did. Mr. Thompson provided a very detailed account of your conversation. He also mentioned that you were wearing what appeared to be unauthorized military insignia." Sarah touched the chain around her neck where her Navy Achievement Medal usually hung. "I wore my service medal, the same one I always wear. It's a standard Navy Achievement Award, nothing special operations related." Detective Morrison made notes as she spoke, but his expression remained skeptical. Sarah began to realize that her word alone wasn't going to be sufficient to resolve this situation. Someone had provided detailed false information about her, and the investigators seemed inclined to believe the accusations rather than her denials. "Detective, I need you to contact my former commanding officer, Commander Rachel Harrison. She can verify my entire service record, my duties, and my character. This whole situation is based on false information. We will be conducting thorough verification of your service record," Detective Morrison replied, "but first we need to address these specific allegations about misrepresentation." The interrogation continued for several more hours, with Detective Morrison presenting additional evidence that someone had carefully compiled against her. There were more photographs from various veterans' events, more witness statements, and even claims about social media posts that Sarah allegedly made about Special Operations Service. "I want to see these social media posts," Sarah demanded. "Show me exactly what I supposedly posted." Detective Morrison hesitated before admitting, "The posts in question have apparently been deleted, but we have witness accounts of their content." This revelation made Sarah even more suspicious about the entire situation. Deleted posts that no one can verify? Witnesses making claims about conversations they claim to remember from months ago? This sounds like someone is deliberately trying to frame me. That's a serious accusation, Ms. Martinez. And the accusation against me is equally serious and completely false, Sarah replied firmly. As the day progressed, Sarah learned more about the specific allegations against her. According to the reports, she had supposedly told various people that she had participated in overseas SEAL missions, had received specialized combat training, and had been involved in classified operations that she wasn't authorized to discuss. Each allegation was more absurd than the last, but they were presented with enough detail to seem credible to investigators who didn't know her personally. Someone had crafted a very convincing false narrative about her military service, complete with specific details that would be difficult to disprove without extensive investigation. "Who would do this to me?" Sarah asked during a brief break in questioning. "Who would go to such lengths to create false accusations about my military service?" Detective Morrison didn't answer directly, but he did acknowledge that cases of deliberate false accusations were not unheard of. Sometimes these situations arise from personal disputes, professional jealousy, or misunderstandings that escalate beyond the original intent. Sarah tried to think of anyone who might have a grudge against her. She had always maintained professional relationships with fellow veterans and had never been involved in any significant conflicts or disputes. Her work as a veterans counselor sometimes involved difficult situations, but she couldn't imagine any of her clients creating such elaborate false accusations. The thought occurred to her that this might be connected to her advocacy work. She had been increasingly vocal about the need for better mental health resources for veterans and had sometimes criticized military bureaucracy for failing to adequately support service members transitioning to civilian life. Could someone in the military hierarchy be trying to discredit her advocacy work? During the evening of her second day in detention, Sarah was allowed to make one phone call. She chose to contact her daughter Emily, who had been trying to reach her since missing their scheduled conversation the night before. "Mom, where are you? I've been calling and texting with no response." Emily's voice carried worry and confusion. "Honey, I'm dealing with a serious misunderstanding involving my military service. I'm being held at the airport while investigators try to sort out some false accusations." False accusations about what? Sarah struggled to explain the situation without causing Emily unnecessary worry. "Someone has accused me of misrepresenting my military service, claiming I said I was a Navy SEAL when I never did. It's completely false, but I have to stay here until they can verify my actual service record." Emily's voice rose with indignation. "That's insane. Everyone knows what your actual service was. Can't they just check your official records?" "They're working on it, but military bureaucracy moves slowly. I just wanted you to know that I'm okay and that this will be resolved soon. Do you need a lawyer? Should I call someone?" Sarah had been wondering the same thing. "I hope it won't come to that. This is just a misunderstanding that should be cleared up once they verify the facts." After the call ended, Sarah felt both better and worse. Better because she had been able to reassure Emily that she was safe, but worse because explaining the situation to her daughter had highlighted just how absurd and serious the accusations were. That night, lying on the same uncomfortable cot, Sarah's mind kept returning to the specific details in the accusations against her. Whoever had created this false narrative knew enough about military terminology and procedures to make their claims sound credible. They had also chosen accusations that would be difficult to disprove quickly, since verifying Special Operations Service records involved additional security considerations and bureaucratic procedures. She wondered if this was connected to her recent speaking engagements at veterans events. She had been increasingly visible in veterans advocacy circles, speaking about the need for better support services and more comprehensive mental health resources. Her presentations had sometimes been critical of military administration and veterans affairs bureaucracy. Could someone be trying to discredit her advocacy work by attacking her credibility as a veteran? If people believed she had lied about her military service, they would be less likely to trust her opinions about veterans issues or support her recommendations for improving veteran services. The more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that these accusations were not the result of simple misunderstandings. Someone had deliberately compiled false information about her with the specific intent of destroying her credibility and potentially ending her career as a veterans advocate. But who had both the motivation and the knowledge to create such elaborate false accusations? And how could she prove her innocence when the burden of proof seemed to have shifted to her to demonstrate that she hadn't done something she never claimed to have done? Sarah's military training had taught her to approach problems systematically, breaking them down into manageable components and developing action plans to address each issue. But this situation felt different from any problem she had encountered during her military service or her civilian career. She was fighting an enemy she couldn't identify, defending against accusations she didn't understand, and trying to prove a negative in a system that seemed designed to assume guilt until innocence could be definitively established. For the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah began to seriously worry that she might not be able to resolve this situation through honest cooperation and faith in the system. The third day would bring new challenges, new accusations, and new evidence that someone was working very hard to destroy her reputation and her life. But it would also bring the beginning of hope that the truth might finally start to emerge, though not in the way that Sarah expected or from the sources she had anticipated. The third day of Sarah's ordeal began with an unexpected development. Detective Morrison arrived with a new colleague, Agent Patricia Chen from the Department of Defense Criminal Investigation Division. Her presence suggested that the investigation had expanded beyond simple accusations of stolen valor into something potentially more serious. Ms. Martinez, we need to discuss some additional concerns that have come to light during our investigation, Agent Chen began, her tone even more serious than Detective Morrison's had been. Sarah felt her heart sink. Additional concerns? What now? Agent Chen opened a laptop computer and angled it so Sarah could see the screen. We've discovered what appears to be evidence of identity fraud connected to your alleged false claims about military service. On the screen was a website for a private security company called Tactical Solutions. Sarah had never heard of the company, but she was shocked to see her photograph prominently displayed on their About Us page, along with a biography describing her as a former Navy SEAL with extensive special operations experience. I've never heard of this company, Sarah said, staring at her own image in disbelief. I never gave them permission to use my photograph, and I certainly never provided that false biography. According to the website, you've been working as a security consultant for this company, trading on your alleged SEAL credentials to obtain lucrative contracts with government agencies. The implications were staggering. Not only was someone claiming that she had misrepresented her military service, but now there was evidence suggesting she had used those false claims for financial gain through fraudulent business activities. This has to be identity theft, Sarah said, her voice rising with desperation. Someone is using my name and photograph to commit fraud. I've never worked for this company, never applied to work for them, never even heard of them until this moment. Agent Chen made notes as Sarah spoke, but her expression remained skeptical. Ms. Martinez, the website indicates that Tactical Solutions has been operating for over 2 years. Your supposed association with them predates the veterans events where you allegedly made false claims about your service. Sarah felt as if she were drowning in accusations that kept multiplying beyond her ability to address them. I don't care how long that website has existed. I've never had any connection to that company. Someone has stolen my identity and created an entire false professional history. Detective Morrison pulled out another document. We contacted Tactical Solutions this morning. According to their records, they have multiple contracts where your supposed expertise as a former SEAL was a determining factor in their selection for security consulting work. Then, they're either lying or they've been deceived by whoever is using my identity, Sarah replied firmly. Call them. Have them provide documentation of my supposed employment. I guarantee you'll find that someone else has been impersonating me. The investigators exchanged glances, and Sarah sensed a slight shift in their attitude. For the first time, they seemed to be considering the possibility that she might be telling the truth about not being involved in the activities they were investigating. Agent Chen made a phone call, speaking quietly with someone at Tactical Solutions for several minutes. When she ended the call, she looked troubled. Ms. Martinez, the company claims to have extensive documentation of your work with them, including signed contracts and correspondence. They're sending copies of everything by secure email. When those documents arrive, I want to examine every signature, every piece of correspondence, and every contract they claim I signed, Sarah said. I think you'll find that someone has been very systematically using my identity for fraud. Over the next few hours, Sarah watched as the investigators received and examined documents from Tactical Solutions. She could see their expressions changing as they reviewed the materials, and she sensed that they were beginning to identify inconsistencies in what they had been told. The signatures on these contracts don't match the signature on your military identification, Detective Morrison observed, comparing documents side by side. Sarah felt the first glimmer of hope she had experienced since this nightmare began. That's because I didn't sign them. Someone else has been signing my name and using my identity. Agent Chen pulled up additional information on her laptop. We're also finding some discrepancies in the timeline. According to Tactical Solutions, you supposedly started working with them while you were still on active duty, which would have been a violation of military regulations. Because it never happened, Sarah said emphatically. I was never involved with any private security company while on active duty or afterward. The investigators continued their examination of the documents, and Sarah could see them beginning to construct a different narrative than the one they had initially believed. Someone had indeed been using her identity, but not in the way they had originally suspected. It appears that someone has been impersonating you for an extended period, Agent Chen finally admitted. The question now is who and why. Detective Morrison looked up from the documents he had been studying. Ms. Martinez, we owe you an apology. It's becoming clear that you've been the victim of identity theft rather than the perpetrator of fraud. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and anger. Relief that they were finally beginning to believe her, but anger that she had been subjected to 3 days of interrogation and detention based on accusations that should have been more thoroughly investigated before she was detained. Who did this to me? She asked. Who has been using my identity and why? That's what we need to find out, Agent Chen replied. But, first, we need to verify your actual military service record and clear you of these false accusations. The investigators contacted the Navy Personnel Command and requested an expedited verification of Sarah's service record. While they waited for the official response, they began examining the pattern of false information that had been compiled about her. The accusations against you were very sophisticated, Detective Morrison explained. Whoever did this knew enough about military procedures and terminology to create convincing false narratives. They also had access to your personal information and photograph. Sarah thought about who might have had access to her personal information. I've spoken at dozens of veterans events over the past 2 years. My photograph and biography have been published in veterans' newsletters and conference materials. Someone could have collected that information and used it to create false identities. Agent Chen pulled up the Tactical Solutions website again and began examining it more carefully. Looking at this more closely, there are some technical inconsistencies that suggest this website might have been created specifically to support false accusations against you. What kind of inconsistencies? The website claims to have been operating for over 2 years, but the domain registration and web hosting records suggest it was actually created much more recently. Someone has backdated content to make it appear older than it actually is. This revelation added another layer to the conspiracy against Sarah. Not only had someone stolen her identity, but they had created elaborate false evidence to support their accusations. The level of planning and technical sophistication suggested this was not a random attack but a deliberate campaign to destroy her reputation. As the afternoon progressed, the official verification of Sarah's military service arrived from Navy Personnel Command. The documents clearly showed her actual service record, confirming her role as a communications specialist and listing all of her legitimate commendations and assignments. There's no indication in your official record of any connection to naval special warfare, Agent Chen observed, reviewing the documents. Because there never was any connection, Sarah replied. I served honorably in communications, exactly as I've been telling you. Detective Morrison was examining the witness statements that had been collected against her. Looking at these statements in light of what we now know, it appears that several of the witnesses may have been deliberately coached or provided false information. You mean the people who accused me were lying? It's possible that some of them genuinely believed they were telling the truth based on false information they had been given. But, at least one of the witnesses, Marcus Thompson, appears to have provided testimony that was deliberately false. Agent Chen was working on her laptop, running searches on Marcus Thompson and the other witnesses who had provided statements against Sarah. We're finding some interesting connections here. Several of the witnesses have business or personal relationships with each other, which suggests a coordinated effort rather than independent observations. Sarah felt vindicated but also disturbed by the implications. Someone organized a group of people to make false accusations against me. This is bigger than identity theft. This is a conspiracy. The investigators were beginning to piece together a pattern of coordinated false accusations, fabricated evidence, and identity theft that painted a very different picture than the one they had initially believed. Sarah had not been the perpetrator of fraud, she had been the victim of an elaborate scheme to destroy her credibility and reputation. Ms. Martinez, we need to ask you about your advocacy work and whether you've made any enemies through your veterans' rights activities, Detective Morrison said. Sarah thought carefully before answering. I've been outspoken about the need for better veterans services and mental health resources. I've sometimes criticized military bureaucracy and veterans affairs procedures. But, I can't imagine anyone being so threatened by my advocacy work that they would go to these lengths to silence me. Agent Chen looked up from her computer screen with a grim expression. We're finding evidence that suggests this attack on you may be connected to your criticism of certain defense contractors who provide services to military personnel. Defense contractors? Companies that provide mental health services, job placement assistance, and other support services to veterans. Your advocacy work has included criticism of some of these companies for providing inadequate services while receiving substantial government contracts. This revelation put Sarah's situation in an entirely different context. If defense contractors felt threatened by her advocacy work, they would have both the motivation and the resources to mount the kind of sophisticated attack she had experienced. We need to contact these contractors and investigate their possible involvement in the false accusations against you, Agent Chen said. As evening approached on her third day of detention, Sarah finally felt that the truth was beginning to emerge. But, she also realized that her ordeal was far from over. The investigators now understood that she was the victim rather than the perpetrator, but they still needed to identify and prosecute whoever had orchestrated the elaborate scheme against her. The fourth day would bring new revelations about the conspiracy she had unknowingly been fighting, and it would also bring an unexpected ally whose intervention would finally provide the validation and support she had been desperately seeking throughout this nightmare. The fourth morning brought an unexpected visitor to the investigation facility. Sarah heard voices in the corridor outside her room, including one that made her heart skip with recognition and hope. When the door opened, she saw Detective Morrison accompanied by a tall woman in navy dress uniform whose bearing and decorations immediately commanded respect. Ms. Martinez, Detective Morrison said, I'd like you to meet Commander Rachel Harrison from Naval Special Warfare Command. Sarah's former commanding officer stepped forward with the confident stride that had always characterized her leadership style. Commander Harrison had been Sarah's supervisor during the final 3 years of her active duty, and, seeing her now felt like a lifeline being thrown to a drowning person. Sarah, Commander Harrison said warmly, extending her hand. When I heard about these ridiculous accusations against you, I knew I had to come here personally to set the record straight. Commander, thank you for coming, Sarah replied, fighting back tears of relief. I've been trying to tell them that these accusations are completely false, but no one seemed to believe me. Commander Harrison turned to address the investigators with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard and respected. Gentlemen, Agent Chen, I've reviewed the allegations against Petty Officer Martinez, and I can state unequivocally that they are entirely without merit. Detective Morrison consulted his files. Commander, we appreciate you coming, but we need to verify specific details about Ms. Martinez's service record and the accusations that have been made. Then, let me be perfectly clear, Commander Harrison replied firmly. Sarah Martinez served under my command for 3 years as a communications specialist. She was one of the most dedicated and honest sailors I ever had the privilege to supervise. The idea that she would falsely claim SEAL credentials is not only impossible but offensive to anyone who knew her service. Agent Chen opened her laptop and displayed the Tactical Solutions website. Commander, are you familiar with this company and any connections Ms. Martinez might have had to private security work? Commander Harrison examined the screen with obvious disgust. This is clearly fraudulent. Sarah never worked for any private security company while under my command, and she would never have been authorized to engage in such activities while on active duty. Furthermore, she would never dishonor the SEAL community by making false claims about Special Operations Service. The commander's presence seemed to shift the entire dynamic of the investigation. Her military bearing, obvious integrity, and detailed knowledge of Sarah's actual service record provided exactly the kind of authoritative verification that the investigators had been seeking. Commander, can you provide specific details about Ms. Martinez's duties and performance during her service? Detective Morrison asked. Absolutely, Commander Harrison replied, pulling out a file she had brought with her. Sarah was responsible for maintaining critical communication systems for our base operations. She held a top-secret security clearance because her work involved classified communications, but that had nothing to do with special operations. She was simply very good at her job in a sensitive area. Sarah felt vindicated as Commander Harrison provided detailed testimony about her actual service record. Every detail the commander mentioned matched exactly what Sarah had been telling the investigators for 3 days. Sarah received multiple commendations for her technical expertise and her ability to maintain communication systems under challenging conditions, Commander Harrison continued. She was recommended for early promotion twice and was considered one of our most reliable personnel. Agent Chen was taking detailed notes. Commander, in your professional opinion, is there any possibility that Ms. Martinez could have been involved with special operations units without your knowledge? None whatsoever, Commander Harrison replied firmly. All personnel assignments, especially anything involving special operations, would have required my approval and oversight. Sarah's duties kept her on base during normal operations periods. She was never deployed with special operations units, never received special operations training, and never had any role beyond her designated communications responsibilities. Detective Morrison showed Commander Harrison some of the witness statements that had been collected against Sarah. We have multiple reports of Ms. Martinez claiming SEAL credentials at veterans events. How do you explain these accusations? Commander Harrison examined the statements with obvious skepticism. These sound like deliberate fabrications or serious misunderstandings. Sarah would never make such claims because she understands better than most civilians the honor and sacrifice represented by SEAL qualifications. She worked with enough special operations personnel to have tremendous respect for their achievements. The commander's testimony provided exactly the kind of authoritative contradiction to the accusations that Sarah had been hoping for throughout her ordeal. But, Commander Harrison wasn't finished with her intervention. I also want to address the broader implications of what has happened here, the commander continued, her tone becoming more serious. Sarah Martinez has become one of the most effective advocates for veterans' rights in this region. Her work helping veterans access mental health services and navigate bureaucratic challenges has been invaluable to our community. Agent Chen looked up from her notes. Are you suggesting that her advocacy work might be connected to these false accusations? I'm stating that Sarah has been increasingly vocal about problems with certain veteran service contractors who receive government funding while providing inadequate support to veterans, Commander Harrison replied. Her criticism has been detailed, well documented, and potentially threatening to companies that profit from government contracts while failing veterans. This observation aligned perfectly with the investigators' own emerging theory about the coordinated nature of the accusations against Sarah. Commander Harrison's testimony provided additional credibility to the possibility that Sarah had been targeted because of her advocacy work. Detective Morrison was reviewing his files with obvious reconsideration. Commander, in your experience, would it be possible for someone to orchestrate the kind of false accusations we've been investigating? Unfortunately, yes, Commander Harrison replied. Defense contractors have substantial resources and sophisticated capabilities. If they felt threatened by Sarah's advocacy work, they would be capable of mounting exactly this kind of attack on her credibility. The commander then provided information that proved crucial to the investigation. I've been in contact with several veterans who attended events where Sarah supposedly made false claims about her service. When I questioned them directly, most admitted they never actually heard Sarah make such claims personally. They had been told by other people that she had made these statements. Agent Chen was typing rapidly on her laptop. So the witness testimony may be based on hearsay rather than direct observation. Exactly. Someone appears to have been spreading false information about Sarah's supposed claims, then, recruiting people to provide witness statements based on that false information rather than their own direct experience. This revelation was damaging to the credibility of the accusations against Sarah, but Commander Harrison wasn't finished. She had also brought documentation that further supported Sarah's actual service record. I've brought copies of Sarah's complete service evaluations, training records, and assignment histories, the commander said, handing over a substantial file. Everything in these records contradicts the accusations that have been made against her. As the investigators reviewed the documentation Commander Harrison had provided, the case against Sarah completely collapsed. Not only did her official records contradict the accusations, but the commander's testimony revealed the coordinated nature of the false claims and provided a credible motive for why someone would want to destroy Sarah's reputation. Agent Chen closed her laptop and looked directly at Sarah. Ms. Martinez, on behalf of the investigation team, I want to formally apologize for the treatment you've received. It's clear that you've been the victim of a sophisticated campaign of false accusations and identity theft. Detective Morrison nodded in agreement. We should have been more thorough in verifying the accusations before detaining you. Commander Harrison's testimony has provided the clarity we needed from the beginning. Sarah felt an overwhelming mixture of relief, vindication, and anger. What happens now? Who's going to be held accountable for what was done to me? We're opening a full investigation into the conspiracy against you, Agent Chen replied. The evidence suggests criminal violations including identity theft, fraud, and possibly conspiracy to interfere with government proceedings. Commander Harrison placed a supportive hand on Sarah's shoulder. Sarah, I want you to know that the Navy stands behind you completely. Your service record is exemplary, and your advocacy work for veterans has been invaluable. We won't allow your reputation to be damaged by these false accusations. The formal end of Sarah's detention came with assurances that the investigation would now focus on identifying and prosecuting whoever had orchestrated the campaign against her. But the emotional impact of her ordeal would take much longer to resolve. As she finally prepared to leave the facility where she had been held for 4 days, Sarah reflected on the experience that had tested her faith in military justice and bureaucratic procedures. She had ultimately been vindicated, but only after enduring interrogation, detention, and accusations that struck at the core of her identity as a veteran and her work as an advocate. Commander Harrison accompanied Sarah as she collected her personal belongings and prepared to return to her normal life. Sarah, I want you to consider taking some time off to recover from this ordeal. What you've been through would be traumatic for anyone. Thank you, Commander, but I think the best thing for me is to get back to my advocacy work. If anything, this experience has shown me how easily the system can be manipulated against veterans who speak up about problems. The commander smiled with obvious pride. That's the Sarah Martinez I remember. You were always someone who turned challenges into motivation for positive action. As they walked toward the exit, Sarah thought about the veterans she counseled and how she would tell them about this experience. She had always advised them to trust in the system's ability to reach the correct conclusions, but her own experience had shown her the system's vulnerabilities and the importance of having advocates who wouldn't give up. She thought about her daughter Emily, who would be relieved to have her mother home safely but who would also learn valuable lessons about standing up for the truth even when it seemed hopeless. She thought about the Veterans Conference where she had been scheduled to speak, and how her story could become part of her message about resilience and the importance of fighting for justice. Most of all, she thought about Commander Harrison's intervention and how crucial it had been to have someone with authority and credibility speak up on her behalf. The commander's willingness to personally investigate the accusations and provide testimony had been the turning point that finally brought truth and justice to a situation that had seemed hopeless. As Sarah finally walked out of the facility where she had been detained, she knew that her ordeal was far from over. The investigation into who had targeted her was just beginning, and she would need to rebuild her reputation and continue her advocacy work despite the trauma she had experienced. But, she also knew that she had been vindicated by the truth, supported by people who believed in her integrity, and ultimately strengthened by an experience that had tested her resolve and her faith in justice. Commander Harrison's intervention had saved not just her reputation, but her belief that the truth would ultimately prevail when good people were willing to stand up and speak up for what was right.